called Rabbit Stew. It's written by Donna Costco and illustrated by Tamara Petrosino. She did the pictures. This is a very funny book.
Hey, have you ever had octopus stew?
I haven't had octopus stew. Let's see who's going to eat the rabbit stew in this book. Once, a while back, in a rickety old shack, there lived a dog. He wasn't very smart. He didn't have much money, but he was happy. The dog had a garden laid out in neat rows, nestled in a sunny meadow. In the spring, the dog planted seeds in his garden, and in the summer, he cared for the plants and watched them grow. Then he would pick and eat the vegetables he had grown. The dog loved his garden. But he had one big problem. Hungry rabbits would sneak into his garden and nibble on his vegetables. They made holes in his cabbage leaves, they dug up his carrots and potatoes, and they chewed on his parsley. The dog tried chasing the rabbits away, but they always came back. Then one day the dog looked out his window and saw those darned rabbits eating all his tender new lettuce plants. That was the last straw. The dog ran into the garden and chased the rabbits around and around until they caught him at last with a leap and a pounce. Thought the dog. Now what should I do with these pesky rabbits? Maybe I'll make them into a rabbit stew. Yes, I think that's what I'll do. So the dog took the rabbits inside and he put them in a large cooking pot and he opened his cookbook. But he couldn't find a recipe for rabbit stew and he didn't know what to do. One clever rabbit said, "You could go into the garden and get some carrots to put in the stew." Good idea, thought the dog. So he said to the rabbits, "You wait right here while I go into the garden to get some carrots." And the little rabbits nodded their head and said, oh yes, we'll try our best."
They're gonna help out.
That was not a good idea.
They're gonna help out.
But as soon as the dog went out into the garden, the rabbits leaped from the pot and scampered happily out the door. When the dog returned, he saw all the rabbits were gone, and he dropped the carrots into the pot, feeling a little disappointed. Can you make a disappointed face? He was a little sad that all his rabbits were gone for his rabbit stew. Let's see what he does next. The next day, when the dog looked out his window, the rabbits were nibbling on his onions. The dog chased them around and around until he caught them at last with a leap and a pounce. Then he took those rabbits back inside and he put them back into the large cooking pot. "Now," said the dog, "I have rabbits and I have carrots to make rabbit stew."
Rabbits can't open doors.
Then one little rabbit said, "You must have celery for rabbit stew." "You're sure?" said the dog. "I'll go out into the garden and get some celery, but this time you have to remember to stay in the pot, okay?" The little rabbits nodded their head and said, oh yes, we'll do our best."
They're gonna lie.
You think they can do it?
They can lie.
But as soon as the dog went out into the garden, all the rabbits scampered happily out the door. When the dog came back, he saw that the rabbits were gone. As he put the celery in the pot, he thought to himself, "Those rabbits aren't very smart. They forgot to stay in the pot again." Who's not very smart?
The rabbits.
The next day, the hungry rabbits sneaked into the garden again. So the dog chased them around and around until he caught them at last with a leap and a pounce. And then he put those rabbits back into the large cooking pot. How many times is that now? 3 times. "I have rabbits and carrots and celery," said the dog. "Now I can make rabbit stew. But you must have potatoes and onions to make rabbit stew, said one clever rabbit. Yes, I know, said the dog, trying to look smart. But if I go out into the garden, you rabbits will forget to stay in the pot. After thinking about it a bit, one rabbit said, you could shut the door, you know. Then we couldn't run out that way. Good idea, thought the dog. Then he said to the rabbits, now you stay in that pot while I go dig up some potatoes and onions. The rabbits nodded their heads and said, what are they going to say?
Yeah.
Oh yes, we'll do our best. Is it going to work?
No.
Where are they going to go?
Out the window.
Out the window. Out to the garden the dog went, closing the door behind him. As soon as he was gone, the rabbits leaped to the window and jumped out. Then away they ran, glad that they had fooled the dog again. Why is his eye doing that? I don't know. I think that's just the way the illustrator drew him. When the dog came back, he saw that the rabbits were gone. He put the potatoes and the onions into the pot, and to his surprise, the pot was full to the top with vegetables. There was no room for rabbits. It's just as well that the rabbits are gone, said the dog, because they wouldn't fit in the pot anyway. I'll just make rabbit stew without the rabbits. Then he felt very proud for having such a good idea. Happily, the dog poured some water into the pot, turned on the stove, and cooked his rabbit stew. It smelled delicious. For supper, he ate 3 big bowls of stew. Then, when he couldn't eat another bite, the dog put some of the leftover stew outside for the rabbits. After all, he said to himself, those rabbits might not be very smart, but they sure know how to make a good rabbit stew. Without rabbits in it. That's a good book. I really